I'm Rachel Gustafson, Senior Director of Curatorial Operations and Research here at the Norton Museum of Art. Today we're going to be looking at a very special exhibition of one of the most important collections of post-war art here in the United States. This exhibition is titled A Remarkable Gathering, the Fisher Landau Family Collection. And that title really speaks volumes because it is truly a remarkable gathering of objects. Emily Fisher Landau is the matriarch of the Fisher Landau family, and essentially she began collecting in 1968, a very critical moment in the history of art here in this country and globally. We're very lucky too to have Candia Fisher, Emily Fisher Landau's daughter, serve on the board. And because of that relationship, we're able to give this rare glimpse into this important collection. What we have is a grouping of 40 objects of more than 1,500 that complete the Fisher Landau Family Collection. Thanks to their generosity, we're really able to showcase an unrivaled art collection. And in doing so, we engage with objects that trace 20th century art and really the core of its critical ideas. When you step back and you understand the scope of time we're considering, the Norton is representing here in this exhibition more than 80 years of art making. The earliest example being a very early flower painting made by Georgia O'Keeffe that dates to 1925. Her paintings really helped define abstraction and what would become a really critical point in modernism for American art. And then the bookend of that is a really playful but philosophical sculpture by the Japanese contemporary artist Yoshimoto Nara from the early 2000s. I should mention that when Mrs. Fisher Landau first began collecting, the first acquisition she made was actually a minimalist square composition by the artist Joseph Albers. While that's not on view in this show, I think what you're able to see as you walk through the exhibition are really some of the core ideas that attracted her to collecting in the first place, which are ideas of bold color, primary shapes, and you see it again and again as we walk through. What she also was interested in early on are these ideas of classical modernism, is what she would call it. Artists that really encapsulate the best that modern art has to offer. And in this first gallery that we walk through, you'll see some of those. One work here by Piet Mondrian is the first ever Mondrian composition on view at the Norton. You also have this very beautifully executed bust by Alberto Giacometti. But the central work when you walk in is undoubtedly the Pablo Picasso painting that dates to 1932. And that's an important year for Picasso. Historians have really dubbed it his year of wonders, and that's because it was the same year that he gets his first major retrospective in Paris. And what we see in this painting is a portrait of the artist's lover, Marie Therese Walter. Although Picasso was married at the time, he did engage in extramarital affairs. And this is one of the women that he had a romantic affair with. So this painting I also find fascinating relating to the years. When we talked about Picasso's work dating to 1932 and it being a really important year for the artist. This work was made in 1958 by Georgia O'Keeffe, and it's part of a body of work that scholars have defined as her late abstractions. And the year, again, is important for me because it relates to two other objects on view in this gallery. The Mark Rothko painting just across the way, as well as the Ellsworth Kelly next to it. So for visitors that come and see this exhibition, it's a really interesting pairing to see what started as this idea of abstraction and something that Georgia O'Keeffe does later in her life, particularly where you see the gradient of the skyline of the canyon valley merging up into this surreal ladder composition and into the moon above. This piece, titled Ladder to the Moon, was actually something that a NASA engineer had written the Emily Fisher Landau family about, saying it was an inspirational painting to them when they were working on the moon landing project. As Emily Fisher Landau began to really grow her interest, she became more and more interested in collecting the art of her own times. Artists that she could connect with. They were living, they were making art, and she could have a very rich relationship with them as she continued to support them throughout their careers. And so Agnes Martin, whose work we see here, is definitely one of those artists. We have two works in this gallery that date to 1960, relatively early in Agnes Martin's career, but also a work from 1995 that was created later in her life. This particular work is titled This Rain, and an interesting note about Agnes Martin is she was a school teacher before she pursued art full-time. And she also was a very dedicated writer. She'd often would write poetry or narratives about her work. And there's a poem actually titled very similar to this painting, again called This Rain, where she would encourage viewers to not look at the stars individually, but look between the droplets of the rain. It's a poetic way to think about her approach to sublimity. That was a term that she would often use to describe these paintings that don't reference really anything tangible in the world, but wanting to elicit a feeling of joy and harmony and balance. And it's something that we see in these early works from 1960, but something that I think she really excels and really achieves great success on as she continues. And this example from 1995 is able to show that that kind of train between earlier and later works, where this gossamer, featherly application of paint in this example is really ultra defined in the later example from 1995. This middle gallery also has other ideas about geometric abstraction and abstract expressionism. This was another area that Emily Fisher Landau really collected in depth. You have an older Willem de Kooning composition, a really powerful Franz Klein monochromatic piece, as well as this John McLaughlin. And again, together, these artists offer an interest in that geometric abstraction that was first really underscored in that Joseph Albers acquisition. So this dedication to artists throughout their career also is part of the third gallery. Robert Indiana, Baldessari, Ed Ruscha, great American artists that would go on to really define pop art or push against it in many cases, such as artists like Cy Twombly, whose untitled work we have here. This was one that, as we uncrated it, it really took my breath away. It was made, or actually I should say began in 1964. That's when Cy Twombly first started developing this composition. And what's interesting for me is when you look at the dates, because if 1964 was when he began it, he actually kind of abandoned the painting for 20 years and only comes back to it in 1984 to finish the composition. And so when you look at this work, the dates list 1964/1984, and that designates this idea of a 20-year gap between the earlier development and then what manifests 20 years later in the 1980s. Cy Twombly, a really enigmatic artist, very hard to define, and again doesn't really fit in any particular school. He did serve in the US Army as a cryptologist, and he lived for many years abroad, Rome being a primary space for him. He would often look to sources such as epic poems, the Iliad, for example, as a source of inspiration. He would look at Michelangelo's sketchbooks. He'd also look at the graffiti all around Rome and this idea of how a passage of time would erase some of the marks that would be seen on the city's walls. And I think this erasure is also really pronounced in this work. You see areas that are smudged and look like where the paint or the oil stick has been applied, there's been pressure to remove it, and in fact that was his process. He would often use his hand to wipe away materials, again to elicit this idea of a passage of time. He'd also often write words in his compositions, and you actually see one up here at the very top. It's just barely discernible, but it reads, "of a shadow of the dream," and again, erased. So this idea of words being put on a surface and then removed from that surface. So Cy Twombly, one of these outliers of the pop art canon, but someone who's just so individual and a painstaking approach to art making over this very odd period of years. And as we make our way into the last gallery, we get to this perhaps final theme that we see, where you have here artists that Emily Fisher Landau would really collect throughout her career, the artist career, artists that were established such as Andy Warhol, Louise Bourgeois, Barbara Kruger, a wonderful Jasper Johns, flag painting, and again Ed Ruscha. And so this continued support is in part of this gallery, but the other part of the gallery represents really artists that were emerging and experimental at the time that Mrs. Fisher Landau collected these works. These were artists that first started to gain attention in the 1980s and into the 1990s. So this dedication to a younger generation of emerging artists really helps define this last gallery. And one of those artists is Mark Tanzi, whose work we see here called Triumph Over Mastery #2. Quite interesting for me when you start stepping back and looking at this composition. What you have is actually this protagonist on the ladder, his shadow obstructing really what you see behind it, which is a reproduction of Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel. This is one that gets even more rich the longer you stand and look at it. When I think about Mark Tanzi's biography, he's the son of 2 art historians, so he would have been very well versed in the history of Western art. And again, this idea of a protagonist whitewashing it, painting it over, and kind of removing its history is witty in some senses and also a little bit challenging. And I think what you can see is his technique as well. This is interesting. Again, when I think of his biography, because he worked as a studio assistant for the artist Helen Frankenthaler, who would often also use reductive qualities. And what you have here with Mark Tanzi is him actually pouring paint onto the canvas and removing it to create the composition that we see. So rather than using paint and applying it to the canvas to create the composition, he's pouring the paint first and then removing it to make these figures emerge from the field. So a fascinating artist and a young emerging experimental artist at the time that Emily Fisher Landau chose to collect his paintings. So when we step back and we really consider this exhibition as a whole, again, this title of A Remarkable Gathering is so perfectly titled. These are artists that have really came to define the 20th century, but also the contemporary moment in which Emily Fisher Landau was inspired to build this collection. When I look at her writings as a collector, the things she shared with the Whitney Museum of Art, there's a quote that stands out to me. Emily Fisher Landau once said, "Never stop learning, never start looking. Art is the greatest teacher." And I think we have a lot to learn from this exhibition.